Anyway, welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. I know some of you, it might be the end of a very long day. So I hope that we've sort of got an interesting 45 minutes for you, and then an interesting Q&A later. I think that where we wanted to start today is with a couple of introductions. So we'll just introduce ourselves very quickly. Adah is then going to explain the format for today, and then we'll get stuck straight in. So a big shout out to, I think we've got some friends from New York, we've got friends from South Africa, we've got friends from, I hope, all over the world. And so hello everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. So I'm going to go the order that I'm seeing on the screen for quick introductions. Tony.
Oh, thank you, Robbie. Yes, I'm Tony Fish. I chair a reporting committee for a bank in data ethics and privacy. I've been reading, researching, developing frameworks to understand the future of oversight and governance as data introduces new risks, which we've neither priced in or can publicly explain the unintended consequences. So that's who I am and what I'm doing.
Thank you very much, Tony. So actually, I'm going to go to Lorraine next.
Thank you, Robbie. Good afternoon. Lorraine Dodd from Cranfield University. I've worked in AI now for over 30 years, principally in decision support, and then working on judgment with Robbie and Bioss. And then the research team at Cranfield looking into reflective agents and development. That's me.
Thank you very much, indeed, Lorraine. Lou.
So my name's Lou Hooper. I'm a human rights barrister at Garden Court Chambers. And I went on sabbatical in 2013, taught myself how to code, and started thinking and researching about the consequences of automation, AI and ML, which led me to existential risk and the interfaces between rights and responsibilities.
Fantastic, thank you. And Adah.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Adah Parris. I wear many hats, but I tend to take a philosophical and anthropological approach to technology. I'm really interested in the anatomy of transformation, so looking for patterns that connect ancient wisdom in natural systems and emerging technology to look at how we innovate.
Fantastic. And Adah, I think you're just going to sort of talk people through what we planned for today and sort of, some of how we planned it.
Yes, so we, as a group, got together, had a couple of conversations. Robbie has a framework that he is going to introduce you to that really starts to explore some of the working relationships that people have with technology and artificial intelligence. And as part of that conversation, Robbie and Lorraine initially came up with an idea. So we are going to take a improv approach to having this discussion. We were challenged to each come up with a thought experiment that really helps us to explore the consequences of working in relationship with AI. Now, for these thought experiments, Robbie and each of us have a different one. Robbie is the only one who has an idea of what they are. So they will be just introduced to each of us as we say them later. And we hope that it provides a interesting and challenging and quite round conversation for all of us. So back to you, Robbie.
Super, Adah. Thanks very much indeed. So yes, here we go. So in the principle of being an extraordinarily high-tech space, we've got some sort of low-tech props. So for anybody who knows me well, they will know that I can't possibly be on an event like this and not talk about my extraordinarily privileged relationship with the late, great Douglas Adams. So this is one of my very favorite pictures of Douglas. This is him thinking at his computer, his beloved Apple, in Camden, when we started the company together in the dial-up days of the internet. And I was very privileged to count Douglas as a close friend. And I'm going to start with a parable that Douglas used to tell. He probably wouldn't thank me for using the word parable because he was a militant atheist, but I'm going to use it anyway. And he used to tell this story about a puddle that wakes up one morning and it looks around at the hole that it's in and it thinks to itself, this hole that I'm in fits me very neatly. In fact, it fits me so neatly, it must have been made specially for me. And the puddle continues to believe that the hole that it's in was made especially for it as the sun comes up and the puddle evaporates. And that was Douglas's plea, I think, for a little bit more humility on behalf of sapiens in believing that we're the apogee of cognition, perception, and intelligence. And indeed, I've got a nice quote here. Douglas is on record as saying that the whole import of the Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy is that we, along with everybody else in the universe, are completely self-deluded as to our own importance in the scheme of things. And I think in the light of all the challenges we face, in the light of the big theme for the whole of CogX, how do we get the next 10 years right? That paradox is the fundamental paradox which we need to hold, which is how do we both celebrate sapiens and simultaneously get over ourselves? And I think that it's that humility about our place in complex adaptive systems that I'm really interested in exploring. And the protocol I'm going to walk you through quickly is designed to be a sort of a series of thought experiments to have us starting to think about that. And so if we can find that enormous creativity and problem-solving potential in a truly creative humility, not a folk humility, not a lie down and take it humility, but a genuine humility about our place in the great big scheme of things, then I think we may have a chance of getting the next 10 years right. So one of the overall frames for this for me is be a good ancestor. Start to think about what our place in the great big scheme of things is. So with that premise, that holding that paradox, that fundamental paradox of recognizing what is special and wonderful about sapiens, but with a bit more humility, recognizing that there are other forms, other ways of being with which we are going to start to interact, with which we already interact. To make a slightly naff joke, no virus has ever read Adam Smith, so no virus believes in the hidden hand of the market. We are, as a species, part of these complex adaptive systems. The other big strand from my working life has been being interested in the nature of judgment and decision-making, human embodiment in complex environments. When it gets to my bit, I'm going to read a poem which I think sort of speaks to some of that. So very quickly, what I've been interested in is a very basic question about AI, which isn't intelligent, it's just data and maths, but a very simple question, which is, what's the work? What's the work we're asking AI to do on our behalf? And that's the protocol that I've written. It asks a few simple questions. They're not value judgments. They're more thought experiments we can use to start to explore the nature of our relationship with that other ontology, with that other being, with that other work. So I'm going to now throw to Lou, or I'm about to throw to Lou, with the first one, which lays out a fundamental premise with which we're starting this entire process. So Lou, I'm going to ask you to talk about accountability.
It's like the Luddite form of PowerPoint. So just to frame what we mean by accountability to start with, when we look at accountability, we need to consider who or what is accountable, how are they accountable, and what's the purpose of it. Broadly speaking, I'm framing this as accountability arises when you're responsible for actions or outcomes and you're expected to justify them. In that way, it enables the allocation of blame and ultimately liability. So ordinarily, you can only be held accountable if you have a degree of control, if you facilitated or caused the harm that has occurred, or you're in a position to prevent or mitigate it. And the reason this is important is so that we can punish the person who is accountable. And punishment can serve several purposes, including deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation, retribution, and restitution. So really what we're thinking about is, can we really tell an algorithm to go and sit in a corner and think about what it's just done? Can a thing be held accountable rather than a person? So, for example, corporations can be guilty of criminal offences like manslaughter, but ultimately that responsibility is held by a human being. And so having thought about all of that, perhaps the ultimate problem is that an AI cannot die, lose its job, or be punished in any meaningful manner. So my thought experiment, and I've no idea who this is going to, is this. A company builds an algorithm designed to identify terrorists. This algorithm is then sold to two countries. We'll call them A and B. And they train the algorithm on their terrorist identification data. That could include their own data provided by third parties, behavioural analytics, current affairs, whatever they choose to train it on. Each country then contracts a private company to run the system at the border. That private company has the ability to change the parameters to take account of geopolitical changes. And in country A, that company does in fact make changes. Two beings from another place then travel to country A and are assessed by an automated system at an electronic border gate. They're permitted to enter. They don't pass a human guard, but in reality, they are evil terrorists and they blow up country A. They then travel to country B, and in country B, they're stopped at the border as the computer identifies them as suspicious. They're then passed to a human being who re-interviews them and decides they're not suspicious and lets them enter. They blow up country B. So my question is, where does accountability lie?
Fantastic. The first throw is in fact to Tony.
I drew a little diagram just in case it helped.
My head's so I'm glad you did your diagram because I did one at the same time. Yeah, thank you, because it sums up so many great problems of accountability. And even in your framing at the beginning, I was going to ask the question, which is AI can't die, and therefore it's not alive, and therefore how can it possibly be held accountable? Because we only have a current series of punishments. And therefore, actually, I think there's two aspects of this, because do we start to look at how we make the humans accountable, which kind of like you framed towards, because company A as a private company has been allowed to change the data, and therefore the people are just allowed in, where company B has identified the people, but they're still allowed through. So there's an allocation of blame, but that comes back to this idea of punishment. And therefore, do we start to have to look at completely different ideologies of what accountability actually means? And we have to stop framing it in the way we currently have it, which is framed by effectively life. And therefore, we have to understand that with something that cannot die, therefore it has longevity, the punishments that we have to levy on it are completely different. Yes, it is a beautiful thought experiment, and I love it. And I just wish I had an awful lot more time to think about it.
Well, these are all encouragements, and hopefully encouragements to think. I think I'm mindful of time, and I think what I'm going to do is I think we're going to make sure we get through each of these, and then we'll be able to have a conversation. So I'm coming to Lorraine next, and this is Lorraine is going to take a word which is advisory. So this is fundamentally a key boundary space when the work that the AI is doing is as an advisor, leaving space for human judgment, discretion, and decision making.
Yes, thank you, Robbie. It's now keeping in mind everything that Lou has just said about accountability. What I want to do is try and work into advisory AI. So this is where the person is being supported in some way in their decision making. And I want to take a slightly different slant on meaningfulness. What I'd like to do first is to imagine that you are a very experienced bomb disposal officer. It's your third tour to Afghanistan. You've just been home and you just started your third tour. It's been a very long day. You've already dealt with 5 incidents successfully. You're on your way home. You're just going back to base. You have one more job, and that seems to be an easy one. So it's all downhill from now. But on the road home, your vehicle is stopped. There's a problem ahead. A multiple find of IEDs on the roadside blocking the main supply route. You have no choice. You have to get out your vehicle and go and help. So you get all your kit together, off you go. The guys have done a really good job. They've set up the cordon. You can walk forward. You've got good electromagnetic protection. You can see they've already put a marked path there. It's quite safe. You can walk up. You don't put your bomb suit on because it's too hot, it's too cumbersome, you haven't got enough time. You can see the devices actually as you approach. They're all laid out. You can see the fusing mechanisms. You're very experienced. You've seen these before. Very, very familiar. You know you've got everything with you. You can daisy chain the fusing mechanisms now. You've got everything you need. You can then retreat back very, very safely, back with your detonation cord, back to the cord and pull everyone back, and there you are, safety. It would be at this critical point of judgment that the advisory AI agent, your advisory AI agent, would be asking you to pause and consider your own safety. You're working outside what would be standard safety procedures here. And it would also be reminding you that you have requisite time. There is enough time to follow the safety procedures here. At this moment, would you, as that experienced bomb disposal officer, take heed and listen to your advisory AI agent? I'll leave you with that question.
Thank you very much indeed. Adah, I'm going to come on that one.
Wow. Thank you, Lorraine. Would you listen? I mean, I have to admit, my mind is blown by that thought experiment, because there are so many things that come to mind with that. I suppose the first one is, where does human judgment come into that? Where's the line between you making a decision for yourself and saying, what are the calculated risks to myself and to others? Where is the level of advice? Gosh, my mind is blown. I think what really starts to come through for me is the idea of how meaningful is that advice? What are the longer term consequences? Yes, you may have time to put on the equipment, but what would be the other implications for yourself and for others at doing that? And where do you start to make that judgment call?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, it's that, I think this, obviously the session was called the Day of Judgment, and one of the big things that has been emerging for me in the sessions that I've chosen is this absolute space between what can and can't tell us, expressed through some form of AI system, and what the nature of human embodiment and judgment and decision making is, and that boundary liminal space. So thank you very much indeed. And we're logging these, and we'll come back to wrap them up together. So in fact, Adah, I'm coming to you next for your thought experiment, and this one is authority. So this is a space where authority has either been explicitly or implicitly granted to an AI system. So this is the question. There you go. Implicit. Perfect. Adah, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Robbie. Yes, so as Robbie says, mine is authority, and I'd like you to keep in mind the idea of explicit and implicit authority. And actually, this is something, my thought experiment is quite current given the current climate that we're in, that we're experiencing globally. So, a HR department automates their freelance hiring processes. Each freelancer is responsible for using desktop software to self-report. The AI learns from the data and is able to source and hire the most suitable candidates for each job based on business KPIs. Freelancer A has high scores across the board and is booked for several jobs over a 6-month period. The freelancer also has several minor complaints of harmless racist jokes on their personnel file, which is kept by HR but not added to the AI system. The freelancer is put onto a new business pitch and makes a harmless racist jokes, which offend the client. The client insists that the freelancer is removed from the business, the incident is reported to HR, and a note is added to their file, but not the AI point system. 6 months later, the AI hires the same candidate for another job with the same client. The client remembers the freelancer and removes the business from the agency, explicitly stating that it is because the agency has kept the racist freelancer. My question, where is the authority sitting to make the decisions? Where was it delegated, or did it just happen?
Fabulous. Thank you very much indeed, Adah. And Lou, I'm coming to you for that one.
So thanks, Adah. So as far as I understand this, you've got a situation where the AI hasn't been updated with relevant information.
Yeah.
Or you've got a designer who's decided that being racist is not relevant information. Or you've got an HR department that has decided that's not relevant to, that being racist is not relevant to the criteria that are applied to a grading system. And the authority for making those decisions would lie with different people within the system, depending on where you were at. So there's no clear chain of authority, as far as I can see, from start to finish, in terms of who is making the decisions and what the impact of those is. If that's the correct understanding of the experiment.
I think it is, and I think it's again the reason for starting to think about these boundary spaces, which is so interesting, is that, you know, when we're talking about these different boundary spaces, they're just designed from a governance perspective to ask these questions, to ask the question of the nature of the advisory work, and whether or not the boundary spaces are being crossed. So, Tony, I'd like you to now think about this question of agency, and this is really this fundamental question of when an AI itself has agency. So I heard a lot of conversation this morning about human in the loop, and this is an exploration of when human isn't in the loop, when the system has, if you like, the company credit card. It doesn't come back and ask any human being and says, shall I, shan't I? It does something, and it has agency. So Tony is going to talk to that one.
Thank you, Robbie. And actually, these thought experiments are so good and need more time. I'm hoping we're going to write them up as questions so we can actually circulate to get other people's opinions, which would be rather helpful. Anyway, yeah, the session we've got is the day of judgment. And what does it mean to have a meaningful working relationship with a non-human actor? So we have freedom, unlike the oppressed and the controlled. You can have a kid, you can get a drink. Indeed, we can eat too much. We can drive freely, walk down the street and have a job. Having that ability and capability to do what you want, when you want, is, in this definition, agency. If we imagine the internet or the smartphone, how Gates, Jobs or Berners-Lee had envisioned, such a system knows what your life goal is. It knows what you plan to do next. It knows your values and can act for you. The system in their vision has agency, a fully autonomous, non-human actor that has your best interest at heart. It can choose to trade a share to achieve your wealth goal. It can book a ticket at a restaurant. It could cancel a meeting to allow more time for you to exercise and actually commit your cash. If instead of a system, this was a life partner or another human you had entrusted, you would have a meaningful working relationship with that third party, as it has agency over you. And they also have their own agency. The question then, When there is no human in the loop and we have an AI with agency over our choices, just like we currently do with a human actor, does that mean AI will by default have its own agency?
Lorraine, I am going to ask whether you heard enough of that to be able to respond.
I heard enough, Robbie, yes. Thank you, and thank you, Tony. It brings up all the questions of, the old cybernetic models. It's where we think about putting those points of agency, and it brings in every question, even when you're dealing with people and thinking about their capability and competency, for giving them agency. The same questions arise. So, but of course, it's now bringing in all the things that we've talked about in terms of accountability and authority. So we're now adding all that into the equation. It's an age-old problem. I don't think it's one that's come particularly with AI. It's always been there, but now it's really, really drawn it into sharp focus as to what agency are we now granting to that non-human, and how can we now? And this is why the focus comes absolutely back on the working relationships. In fact, more than working relationships, it's the delegation of decision rights. It's all of those decision right relationships that the organisational piece that we need to really think about.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to take one which is the final one, which is I've reached my props here, and this one is an interesting one. I hope you can see it. It's abdication. Now, again, bear in mind these things aren't value judgments, and I'm going to do two. I'm going to slightly cheat, so it's fair. But I'm going to get to read a poem first. And this is a poem which some of you may know. And it seems to me to have some very interesting echoes, some of the relationship and indeed some of what can be magical thinking that I think goes on about the nature of data and knowledge and AI. And there's a big debate about whether this poem is meant straight or whether it's meant ironic. But it's a famous poem called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which was written in 1967, the height of the counterculture movement, by Richard Brautigan. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony like pure water touching clear sky. I like to think, right now, please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. I like to think, it has to be, of a cybernetic ecology where we're free of our labours and going back to nature, return to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace. All watched over by machines of loving grace. And this abdication space, when I talk about this 5 A's AI protocol, is one that elicits a lot of thought. And here's my thought experiment, which is a real jump from the theme machines of loving grace. But it's about, again, where and how humans cross a boundary where they have effectively, or they are at risk of abdicating that conscious quality of human judgment. So imagine a prison officer, and she is taking a prisoner down to meet her cellmate for the first time. And the prisoner has been allocated this cell by an algorithm. There was a report that the European Commission came out with last year, reporting on an algorithm which does precisely this thing. So the allocation has been made by an algorithm, and the prison warder takes the new prisoner down to introduce her to her new cellmate. And in the 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes of introduction, something tells her something's up. Doesn't feel right. So what happens next is absolutely critical. Does she go back to the prison warder, and the prison warder says to her, Mary, if you doesn't feel right, get her out now? Does the prison warder say, hey, look, Mary, the algorithm we've got, whatever it's called, it's cut prison violence by 35%, so I'm going to need more than a feeling? Maybe worst of all, does Mary suppress her judgment and not say anything at all? And so in that sense, she abdicates at that moment to the AI system. And she goes off duty. And the next morning she comes in and some poor prisoner has, had the crap beaten out of her. And it's those moments of when we cross over, when we start to see our skills atrophying, our judgment atrophying, because judgment's like a muscle. We need to use it. We need to use it. We need to use it. So here's my question, and I'm going to throw it to Lou. What would be the proper response at that moment from the prison governor?
To allowing the guard to take the decision, or to requiring it to be overridden by the computer?
That's my question. What are the rules of engagement properly at that moment?
I mean, this is a theme that's running through all of the thought experiments, which is really how much risk are we willing to live with, and where are we placing that risk? Are we placing it on a machine in an attempt to abdicate responsibility? Are we keeping it within ourselves so that we have the responsibility? Or is it something else that we haven't yet really defined? And I think we're moving towards a position where we want to place blame on something else because we want to abdicate responsibility to a thing, but we're not legally capable of, and I say that with my lawyer hat on. And it comes back to a sort of more fundamental issue, which is how much do we trust the machines to be right? Because it may well be that the feeling that the prison officer has is wrong. And so you then end up working on percentages. So I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to your question.
No, I think that's one of the fascinating things about these thought experiments, is that in a way is what they're designed to do, and that's what thinking about the nature of advisory work, the nature of authority that may or may not now being wielded, the nature of the agency, how risky is the agency? If it's algorithmic trading, if it's Parris thought an autonomous weapons system. When do we abdicate? And then the nature, as you say, that fundamental nature of accountability is that there's not an ethical system, any normative system that doesn't have within it the capacity, wherever you are in society, to punish transgression, to deal with transgressors from feeling pain, shame, guilt, remorse. And I think that one of the things that I've begun to hear, the theme of CogX this year, that I hadn't been hearing before, which I think is very interesting, is thinking about power and agency, power relationships. Because the whole thing about science fiction is that it worries that power will be coercive. But actually, we need to worry about power that is much more utilitarian in our lives than that. And Adah, I wondered if you wanted to think a little bit about the nature of which voices we hear in this debate, and what beginning to think about what those power relationships look like.
Yeah, thank you, Robbie. I think one of the things that started to really come through when listening to all of these is the idea of trust and transparency and levels of power. Is power taken, or is that given? But I think, when I've been listening to some of these, really thinking about if these were human to human relationships, where would be the levels of power? Well, first of all, how do we build trust to be able to abdicate some of our responsibilities, or some of our authority, or some of our agency to somebody else? Because those actions actually start to really change the idea of the amount of risk that we're willing to take. And if we only hear from a particular type of voice or a particular type of authority or a particular type of power, then that changes the nature of the relationship that we're going to have. It changes our ability or our own levels of judgment, because we may have perceived that level of power, that level of authority, to be more respectful, more valuable than anything else. So I think a lot of this I know that we're running short on time, but I would like to explore some of that in the Q&A, the conversation around levels of power and how do we start to make decisions about which bits are more valuable than others. And I think that starts to come down to the idea of trust.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I think trust and trustworthiness are obviously, what does it mean to entrust to an AI system? What does that begin to look like, particularly when, and I'm going to come to Lou now to start something which I said we wouldn't set chasing. I'm keeping an eye on the time, which is trust, because of course trust for humans is based on some form of reciprocity, which of course in a way is a nonsensical notion for an AI. So I mean, we were talking as we're preparing this a little bit about rights and obligations and what it means, because an AI can't have an obligation to you. So I wondered, from a rights and an obligations perspective, I know we promised ourselves we wouldn't go down this rabbit hole, but where the conversation's headed, I thought that might be an interesting throw. And then just everybody, we've got 7 minutes, and I'm going to want to come to everybody to do a quick wrap up before we head off into the Q&A session, which I hope as many of you will join us for as you possibly can.
So rights and responsibilities.
Yeah, for a non-human thing.
But I think most humans don't understand what a right is to start with. So enabling them to code a machine that understood that, or for a machine to learn it, would be quite difficult. But for a machine to have responsibilities, you could tell it and teach it what its responsibility was, but you couldn't enforce that afterwards. And so I think this comes back to the idea of the purposes of punishment, which a lot of that's to frighten somebody into submission, either because of deterrence or because they're going to be sent to prison or because they're going to have to pay money, or the second purpose might be rehabilitation. And that's something that maybe by learning from what you've done, if you're a machine that learns, you might be able to do. But we also have a very human notion of retribution, which comes from this sense of rights and responsibilities. You're responsible to me to do this. I have the right that this will not be done to me, and I have a right for retribution and restitution if that goes wrong. And it's very difficult to see how you could get retribution from an algorithm or a machine. And that brings up a really interesting notion of whether or not retribution is a good thing in any event. But that's a whole other debate. So
thank you, Luke. No, it's really interesting, and maybe we'll get a chance to pick that up. Tony, can I come to you next for sort of some thoughts which might lead us into the Q&A?
Yes, and there's a framing for me, which is one I'm struggling with, and I share it not because I've got an answer, but much more because I'm going through the same process myself, which is, what can digital be if it is not bounded by our definition of life? And what Lou just described is everything that's human. And we've got to create digital models which are everything but human. And when we describe life in its most fundamental level by two things, which is one, to propagate, and second, to adapt. And actually our lives are bounded by death. And death itself defines our version of life, which is therefore to propagate, which overcomes death, and to adapt, to avoid death. So within this system we've created, it is bounded by this idea of death, which then introduces the ideas of punishment. In a digital world, we don't have that. So what do these things look like in a digital world? And I don't know. But kind of like that's why we struggle so much, because we haven't got the equivalents and we can't hold these machines to anything because we have no retribution, because they're things that are deeply human. So I'm struggling with the very question which says, what can digital be if it is not bounded by our definition of life?
That's a great question. Lorraine, I'm going to come to you quickly. We've got 3 minutes. 3 minutes left now.
I just want to come back to your point, Robbie, about trust and the trust that we place in AI, and then can it live up to its inherent trustworthiness? And I think again, it's as I said before, it's we need to think about that when we're thinking about placing people into places of judgment and what we can entrust to that person or what we can entrust to the AI agent. So I think it really puts the focus absolutely squarely back onto working relationships. And that's why I was really pleased that this session was looking at relationships. It's what's going on between stuff that we now really need to put our focus on. And looking at boundaries.
Fantastic, Lorraine. Thank you. Adah?
Yes, very quickly. So picking up on what Tony said, you know, when I'm thinking about summation of all of this, the word that came up was human. I think that we are trying to put our experience and our knowledge of human relationships and interactions onto AI, which is actually processing maths and data and insights. And I think that that's where some of the difficulty is starting to come, is happening, because we are trying to use our current models of relationship and interrelationship and then applying that to something that doesn't have a consciousness. It doesn't have that judgment or that levels that we are used to. And I think that we need to think about how we create new types of relationships and understanding what the measure of success of those actually is.
Terrific, thank you. Well, we've queued up, I hope, some really good things. I'm not sure how long we've got now, but I'm going to go into Q&A with 3 questions about accountability, which is a system that is consistently able to ask, how's that working for us? Think about what do we mean by that in this particular context. Critically, to ask the question, who do we mean by us in this context? Who is that us? And lastly, and very importantly, of whom or what are we asking those first 2 questions? Which, to drop a quick bit of philosophy at the end, is a very Aristotelian notion. It's go ask the fisherman. It's go ask the front line how this is working. So I think we're about to end. Please join us in the Q&A. We would love to continue. We'll continue the conversation anyway. But if you're asking some questions, then it will be lovely to see you. And thank you all very much indeed for joining.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.